In the Jordan Valley, just north of the Dead Sea, archaeologists digging through the ruins of a Bronze Age city found something that should not exist. Pottery shards melted on the outside while remaining completely intact on the inside, as if blasted by heat so sudden and so extreme it had no time to travel through the material. Mud bricks fused together into something closer to glass than clay, a destruction layer, blanketing the entire settlement at once, consistent with temperatures no ordinary house fire, no siege, no earthquake could produce. And in an ancient text written centuries later, a story about two cities destroyed by fire raining down from the sky, their names still used today as shorthand for total sudden ruin. Sodom and Gomorrah. For decades, most scholars treated that story as pure legend, with no fixed location and no physical evidence. Then archaeologists at a site called el-Hammam started finding a destruction layer that looked less like legend and more like a crime scene. This is the undertold, and some mysteries refuse to die. If this is your first time here, subscribe. We dig up buried history every week. El-Hammam sits in the southern Jordan Valley on the eastern side of the Jordan River, roughly 14 kilometers northeast of where the Jordan empties into the Dead Sea. During the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years ago, this was not a small village. It was one of the largest fortified cities in the entire region, with massive earthen ramparts, a monumental gate complex, and a population archaeologists estimate may have rivaled or exceeded contemporary Jericho. This was, by the standards of its time, a genuine metropolis, sitting in what was then some of the most fertile, well-watered farmland in the region, a plain the Bible itself describes as being like the garden of the Lord before its destruction. Whatever happened here did not happen to some minor outpost. It happened to one of the most important cities in the entire Jordan Valley. The biblical account found in the book of Genesis describes Sodom and Gomorrah as two of 5 cities of the plain near the Dead Sea, destroyed in a single catastrophic event after their populations had, according to the text, become irredeemably corrupt. The description is specific and violent. The Lord rained down burning sulfur on the cities, and the text says Abraham, watching from a distance the next morning, saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. Lot's wife, famously, is turned into a pillar of salt during the escape for looking back at the destruction. Strip away the theological framing for a moment, and what remains is a description any modern disaster investigator would recognize. Intense, sudden heat, airborne burning material falling from above, smoke visible from a great distance, and, strangely specific, salt. That last detail is about to matter a great deal. When archaeologists excavated el-Hammam's destruction layer, dated to approximately 1650 BCE, they found something that did not match the slow, patchy damage of a typical ancient war or accidental fire. The destruction was site-wide, sudden, and extraordinarily intense. Pottery fragments were found melted on their outer surface, while the interior remained unaffected, a signature that requires an extremely brief, extremely hot thermal pulse, not the sustained burn of a structure fire, which typically cooks a ceramic vessel evenly all the way through given enough time. Mud brick walls, which should simply crumble or blacken in an ordinary fire, were found partially vitrified, essentially melted into a glass-like state, a transformation that generally requires temperatures north of 1,500 degrees Celsius, hotter than a typical Bronze Age kiln, let alone a burning house. Alongside the melted material, researchers documented something called shocked quartz, mineral grains bearing microscopic fracture patterns that, on Earth, are almost exclusively associated with two things: nuclear detonations and extreme impact events, like meteorite strikes. They also found tiny spherical particles of melted material, sometimes called Meltglass or impact spherules, which form when material is instantaneously vaporized and then resolidifies as it cools in the air. A process consistent with an extremely energetic airburst or impact. Rather than a grounded fire of any kind, humans could realistically set with torches or siege weapons in the Bronze Age. Whatever struck this city, on a purely physical level, appeared to hit it from above and hit it hard. And then there is the detail that connects most directly back to the ancient text: salt. Researchers documented unusually high concentrations of salt embedded throughout the destruction layer at el-Hammam, a striking anomaly for an inland farming settlement with no natural salt deposit of its own. One proposed explanation ties directly to the site's location near the Dead Sea, one of the saltiest bodies of water on Earth. An explosive airburst, powerful enough to vaporize and displace Dead Sea water and sediment, could, in theory, scatter that salt content across the surrounding farmland and settlement, salting fields that had previously supported dense agriculture for centuries and rendering them unusable for a generation or more afterward. A city destroyed in an instant, and then salted so thoroughly that nothing would grow there again. It is difficult not to notice how closely that image tracks a woman turned to salt for looking back at exactly this kind of destruction. In September 2021, an international team of geologists, archaeologists, and impact specialists published their interpretation of all this evidence in the peer-reviewed journal Scientific Reports, part of the Nature Publishing Group. Their conclusion: el-Hammam had been destroyed by a cosmic airburst, an exploding meteor or comet fragment detonating in the atmosphere with a force comparable to the 1908 Tunguska event in Siberia, which flattened roughly 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving an impact crater at all, because the object exploded before ever reaching the ground. The researchers proposed that a similar airburst over the Jordan Valley, around 1650 BCE, could explain the melted pottery, the shocked quartz, the vitrified mudbrick, and the salt anomaly all at once. And that the memory of this genuinely catastrophic skyborne destruction event, passed down through generations of oral tradition, eventually became the written account of Sodom and Gomorrah's fiery destruction from above. The paper made international headlines, and for several years, the city the Bible calls Sodom was destroyed by a meteor, became one of the most widely repeated science stories connecting archaeology to scripture. Then, the scientific process did what it is supposed to do. Other geologists and impact event physicists began publishing detailed critiques, arguing that several of the paper's key mineralogical claims did not hold up to independent testing, that the comparison to Tunguska specifically was based on a flawed reading of that event's actual blast physics, and that ordinary, non-cosmic explanations, including intense structure fires and normal warfare, could plausibly account for much of the same evidence. The concerns accumulated for years, and in April 2025, Scientific Reports formally retracted the original paper entirely, citing the accumulated technical critiques and stating the editors were no longer confident in its central conclusions. The meteor did not disappear from history, the paper claiming to prove it did. So where does that retraction leave us? A destroyed city with genuinely strange, still undisputed physical evidence, and a withdrawn explanation for what caused it. Tell me in the comments: airburst, ordinary catastrophic warfare, or something the retraction hasn't fully settled either way. I read every one. And if you want the version of history that follows the evidence, even when the exciting explanation turns out to be wrong, subscribe, because the identity question, whether this city was ever actually Sodom in the first place, is about to get even messier. Even setting the meteor question aside entirely, there is a second, separate problem with calling el-Hammam Sodom. The dates barely fit. The site's destruction layer is dated to roughly 1650 BCE, during the Middle Bronze Age. Biblical chronology, based on the genealogies and timeframes given in the text itself, generally places Abraham, and therefore the destruction of Sodom, which occurs during his lifetime in the narrative, considerably earlier, with many traditional estimates falling in the Middle Bronze Age as well, but with real scholarly disagreements spanning centuries in either direction, depending on which biblical dating method is used. It is not necessarily a disqualifying mismatch, but it is far from the clean, undisputed match popular headlines often implied, and biblical scholars specializing in chronology remain divided over whether the tall el-Hammam destruction date and the traditional Sodom timeline are actually describing the same historical moment at all. Tall el-Hammam is also not the only site archaeologists have proposed as Sodom, and the leading alternative sits in an entirely different part of the region. On the southeastern shore of the Dead Sea, roughly 40 kilometers south of Tall el-Hammam, sit the ruins of edh-Dhra, and 20 kilometers further south, Numeira, early Bronze Age settlements excavated since the 1970s that show their own clear, dramatic destruction layers, complete with burned roof timbers and thick ash deposits. For decades before Tall el-Hammam entered the conversation, these southern sites were the leading academic candidates for Sodom and Gomorrah, based partly on their location, matching certain traditional and early Christian-era descriptions of where the cities of the plain were believed to have stood, clustered near the Dead Sea's southern basin rather than its northern end. The southern candidates have their own dating problem, and it cuts the opposite direction from Tall el-Hammam's. edh-Dhra's destruction is generally dated to around 2350 BCE, and Numeira's to a notably different period, roughly 2.5 centuries apart from edh-Dhra's, meaning the two sites most often paired together as Sodom and Gomorrah may not have even been destroyed in the same event, or even the same century as each other, let alone in a single simultaneous catastrophe as the biblical account describes. So, the field currently has two competing candidate clusters, one to the north near Tall el-Hammam, and one to the south near edh-Dhra, and neither cleanly satisfies both the geography and the chronology that biblical tradition would require all at once. Archaeology has found several genuinely destroyed Bronze Age cities in this region. It has not conclusively matched any single one or pair of them to the specific narrative in Genesis. Strip away the Sodom question entirely, and Tall el-Hammam remains an extraordinary archaeological site on its own terms, which is easy to lose in a debate that keeps circling back to whether it matches a specific biblical story. This was a major, thriving, well-fortified Bronze Age city that was suddenly and violently destroyed, so thoroughly that the surrounding region, according to the archaeological record, appears to have been abandoned or significantly depopulated for centuries afterward, before resettlement eventually resumed. Whether the cause was an airburst, a catastrophic fire during warfare, or some other violent event archaeology hasn't fully reconstructed yet, something genuinely catastrophic happened to a real city, to real people, at this real location, roughly 36 centuries ago. And that event would be a significant historical mystery, even if the book of Genesis had never been written. The broader Bronze Age, as it happens, includes several documented instances of sudden, catastrophic regional destruction that archaeologists still debate the causes of. The still mysterious, late Bronze Age collapse centuries later across the eastern Mediterranean, various sites showing destruction layers attributed to earthquake swarms along regional fault lines, and ongoing scientific debate about how frequently airbursts and small impact events actually struck populated regions of the ancient world without leaving the kind of obvious crater that makes an impact easy to identify centuries later. Tall el-Hammam's destruction sits inside this larger, genuinely unresolved scientific question. How do you distinguish in the archaeological record between a city destroyed by human hands and a city destroyed by something that came from the sky? when both can leave startlingly similar evidence of fire, heat, and sudden ruin. Excavation and analysis at Tal el-Hammam continues, and the retraction of the 2021 paper has not ended the underlying research. It has redirected it. Researchers on multiple sides of the airburst debate are now re-examining the original mineralogical samples, retesting the shocked quartz identification with independent laboratories, and re-evaluating whether the Salt Anomaly has explanations beyond a Dead Sea airburst, including the possibility of long-term soil salinization from unrelated environmental changes. This is, in the most literal sense, science working exactly as intended. A dramatic claim, made publicly, followed by scrutiny, followed by correction, with the actual physical evidence at the site remaining exactly as strange and worth investigating as it was the day archaeologists first found melted pottery lying next to unmelted pottery in the same layer of ash. What we're left with, honestly, is not a solved mystery wearing a biblical name tag. It's a genuinely destroyed ancient city whose destruction still doesn't have a fully agreed upon cause, sitting in a region with at least one other strong candidate for the same biblical story, connected to a scientific paper dramatic enough to make headlines and flawed enough to be formally withdrawn 4 years later. Somewhere in the Jordan Valley, roughly 3,600 years ago, something ended a thriving city in what the archaeological evidence suggests was a single, sudden, extraordinarily hot event. And whether the right word for that event is meteor, war, or something archaeology hasn't identified yet, the ash and the melted stone are still there, waiting for an explanation that fits every piece of evidence at once, not just the parts that make the best headline. Some mysteries refuse to die,